Yes, yes, yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world watching Social Confoes. Glad you could join us on a interesting day in Suriname. Day
A very
two of
hot day.
day 2 of the Suriname Energy, Oil, and Gas Summit. And we've dedicated this week's episode towards the oil and gas industry. So that's a great way to kick it off. I first have to say, if you haven't connected with Social Confos yet, make sure to connect with Social Confos on Instagram. And don't forget to subscribe to Diego Amarali's YouTube channel to see all the videos live when they happen. And with that, I bring it to you, Diego. Let's talk a bit about today's topic.
Definitely. So we're bringing up this topic because we kind of want to every now and then touch on topics that are very current, very relevant. It might not be relevant in a few months' times, but because there's an event, and I'd say international event today around oil and gas industry, we thought we share our unqualified take as two individuals who have actually almost nothing to do with the oil and gas industry from a engineering, from a business, from a education perspective. But we will try to give our takes based on our experience because both of us went today, took a quick walk around, see what the developments are, who's here. We didn't go to the delegate meetings because we weren't registered for that. Just checked out the exhibitions. But you can hear now and then people talking about what's in store for us and why is this relevant? Why is there so much hype around the oil and gas industry nowadays, Jean-Luc, especially in Suriname and the
Okay, okay,
region?
okay. So let's give a little bit of a background for those who are less familiar with the oil and gas. And I want to be careful because the title of today's session says the take on the oil and gas industry. We're gonna narrow it down to just Suriname, right? I think that's I think the most
Yeah,
important thing.
emphasis on an unqualified take
Okay,
in,
because
in Suriname.
otherwise you can have a very long take, and that could be a qualified or an unqualified take, but a very long take on the oil and gas industry. But let's focus on Suriname. So I think what's important is that in the 80s, our state oil company Staatsoli was born. I think that's a very important step in the oil and gas industry in Suriname, and it's kind of our pride. Having your own state oil company, the slogan is also "Vertrouwen in eigen kunnen," which literally translates in "You have to believe in yourself," which is a pretty big statement for us. It is our pride. It's one of the pride possessions that we have is that we have a state-owned oil company, and I think it starts there. That's the starting point. For years, our oil company was onshore oil, so basically drilling oil from uh, the piece of land that is Suriname. And only recently, and we're talking about the last decade, offshore oil has really come up as one of the main potentials for us because there is a lot of oil in front of the Guyanas. We have to take a little bit of geographical context as well because to our west is Venezuela, which is already known as a renowned oil state. Next to it is Guyana, which is our big brother, our small, nah, basically our big brother in certain sense, their small brother in another context. But also there is some rivalry between Suriname and Guyana, which luckily for us now is more of a brotherly situation, which is really good. And then we have Suriname. There is also French Guiana next to us, which is an overseas department of France. It still falls under the government system of France, and they have a completely different approach to oil and gas, the French than Guyana and Suriname have for different reasons. So I think that's important to have the context to know that Venezuela, of course, is a big oil player when it comes to South America and the Caribbean. And we're basically have a couple of basins which you can say are in the similar route across the ocean north of these countries. So that's where the offshore comes from. I think one of my close friends, Mark, was had to make a decision whether or not he would study offshore um, as a civil engineer, and that was back in I think 2007 or 8. He had to make that decision to master in one of the two. So it was already a big thing back then, and something to consider. And we currently have a lot of uh, contracts with big oil companies, with big oil players, but we're still in the discovery phase and even the bidding phase in some situations. Whereas Guyana, our neighboring country, actually already has produced their first batch of offshore oil. So that's to have a little bit of a context historically where we are now. We have had several discoveries. If I remember correctly, it's around 8 discoveries already, offshore discoveries in at the on the coast of Suriname. There has been some nearshore activity. They don't call it nearshore. They
I think it's a shallow something, right?
shallow
Something like that.
something, but it's basically nearshore. And also, there currently is a bidding going on for other oil blocks to discover if there's oil available. So that just gives a general, I think, a general understanding where we are in the oil field right now. And that means we're on the forefront of becoming a pretty big player in the international oil business. And then there's one thing to consider and take into context as well. Our state oil company has a top of the line refinery, but that refinery is focused on onshore oil. So there's a whole other refinery business for offshore oil, which still has to be developed when it comes to the oil and gas industry in Suriname, as well as the local content. As and with local content, it's not like in the field of what we usually talk about, as in creative local content,
Yeah, we
but
need
this
to
is
elaborate
local.
on that in a bit
So
as
this
well,
is
right?
local content, as in companies that will serve the big oil and gas companies that approach and come to Suriname.
So before we go to local content, because that is a interesting topic, I do want to dive a bit deeper in. But you set a stage there, especially with the um, highlighting, Venezuela had been one of the big producers, and now Guyana is basically a step ahead because they are a step ahead because they're already extracting. And you can see or take stock of, how potential developments can go. Like Venezuela is, they've been had a peak, but then a quick downfall as well because of the way the industry was managed. And I'm not very qualified to, take a deeper economical or political look at it, but it has had an impact on the nation in a later stage. Even Trinidad at one point had offshores, I think, and they peaked for a decade or something and then quickly diluted again. So I'm cautiously looking at Guyana as well,
It's interesting.
how that plays out in real time because it is the closest it's been to us and especially this. And now we are at the, you know, the precursor of what's to come and how the nation and the companies are going to play into that. But
We
you're
have to
saying,
learn from Trinidad. I think we in this case we have to learn from Trinidad. And the reason why we have to learn from Trinidad is because they have been through this process. And over the past decade, a lot of Trinidad companies who made a lot of money successfully in the period that they were benefiting from the industry, they are expanding to other countries to diversify their portfolio, to connect, to have business in other Caribbean countries as well. And it's really interesting because you have to look at the infrastructure, but also the relationship between different countries and the European countries. Like, and I'm going a little bit off topic here, but it's very important to know when you're discussing on, let's take a similar approach. It's important to know that there are Caribbean countries that are Commonwealth that have been ex old colonies
Yeah, that
of the
includes
UK, of
Trinidad
the
and
British.
Guyana. Yeah, they
Yes,
are Commonwealth.
exactly. You have the Caribbean countries that were under the French system that became departments. And then you have the Spanish speaking countries and the Dutch speaking countries, which have very different structures from the English speaking countries and the French colonies, so departments. So I think that's something as well to look at, especially when it comes from a policy perspective. And I think looking at Trinidad is a good way to look at it, because if you're going to look at Venezuela, there's a lot of political importance there. So it's very hard to look at Venezuela if you're not gonna do the
And
same.
also from a scale perspective, right? From a scale perspective, I think like
Well,
Trinidad and Guyana are much closer in scale to a country like Suriname.
yes, definitely, but don't underestimate the scale of Guyana at the moment, like where they're already at. And I think one of the things that is definitely going to be discussed today in this unqualified take is like, how much does society actually benefit from it? So how much does the average inhabitant of a country benefit from the oil and gas industry? Because we've seen the impact for Venezuela.
Yeah.
Like, it's not really that there are people there they have benefited, but it's not like it saved the country or propelled the country into
Even
a state
Trinidad,
of.
right? Because you mentioning like the companies that have been in the industry basically expanding their portfolio. So does it pay it forward to the local economy? And you mentioning local content before. I'm curious to elaborate more on that. So when you say local content, and I've been through several of the booths, and you hear this term come up a lot, local content, and a lot of them talk about that education, the safety certification that go with it when you're going to work offshore, when you're going to a rig. So how much of that in that context qualifies for, the average citizen as a work opportunity, as a business to do that, and how will that flow back into the local economy?
Okay, so here's there's several things that are interesting. First of all, um, don't underestimate the quality of the technicians in Suriname. I think that's one of the things that's underrated. Um, One of the most popular schools, high schools in Suriname, is Natin. It's the Technical Institute. It's one of the most popular schools. We have a lot of technical talent in Suriname. I'm not worried about the tech jobs. I actually think we are not fully prepared, but we'll get a lot of our young tech students will get amazing opportunities in the next 10 years. So if you're in the tech field, I mean, as a technician, I would educate
Yeah.
myself, because
Any type of
there are a lot of
engineering, mechanical, electrical,
anytime any kind
civil.
of engineering, you're set. If you live in Suriname, you're a student at the moment, a high school student, you could be set for life. Because in this industry, and I actually experienced it. I was on a flight to Guyana, or actually a flight to the US, but going through Guyana. And I was on the plane with several Surinamese engineers who were going to go to an offshore rig in Guyana to work there. So there's already opportunity there. So I think from the tech side, I'm fully confident that we have an educational system that might not be perfect, but could be suited. But that's on especially low entry jobs. And then we get to the mid level and the high level entry jobs. And that's where it gets difficult. And then we're not even talking about suppliers. Like, when we realize, like, some of the big players in Suriname, big companies, we look up to them. are telling us like, hey, we don't have the resources to supply this emerging market. We don't have the resources to supply. We have to collaborate with other international companies to be a preferred supplier for the oil and gas industry. And that really comes down to two things:
And
resources, having enough people to serve, but also the quality of work and the educational level of the type of work that we need to do.
when you mentioned supplier there, like what should I understand under supplier? Like facility,
Anybody that
like
supplies.
workforce,
So it could be workforce supply, it could be technical supply, it could be even uh, food and
food,
beverages.
and yeah.
It could be even be communications. It could be any kind of supply that the companies, the oil and gas industry hires you to provide a product or a service. So any kind of supplier.
All right. So then I went to draw a parallel because we mentioned local content in the content of, you just mentioned suppliers providing any type of supplier, workforce, engineers. There's opportunity there. If you draw the perspective to the rest of business and in more in our case, our specialty of the different type of local content we usually talk about, how do you see that relationship with that type of content in relationship to the local content they talk about in the summit? Like, is it bad branding that they call it local content that people get confused because the first time I hear it, I go different directions,
No, I
or
mean, no, the only people that confuse are the people in the creative space, and the creative space is not that big, and the creative space is not as important as from an economic perspective. So that's the kind of the fight I think I'm struggling with the most, is that in one sense the money will be in this industry. That's something you have to understand. So if you're like, if money is important to you, if you want to see Suriname get wealthy from a financial perspective, I think it's a really important thing that you understand the market, because the amount of opportunities that are available are enormous. But then again, they're at such a high level that we don't locally have enough people that can pick up those tasks, can pick up those qualifications. So what ends up happening is that people get brought in from abroad, and you get this kind of expat society with people that have that expertise in their respective fields. So if you don't dive into creating opportunities for us as a country, we're gonna lose out. That's what happens in Guyana. That's what happened in a lot of other oil industries and countries. Is that the middle the average uh, the average society kind of member doesn't get involved in this kind of business. First of all, they don't understand it, and when they don't understand, if they don't understand it, they don't have the network to get in. And even if they have the network to get in, they often don't have enough capital to join in as well, because this is a cruel situation, right? You have to have a certain amount of capital to be able to buy your way in, kind of almost.
yeah, because it kind of looks like the stage is set basically for very corporate level, and there's very niche industries because I walked around and you hear about organizations, about companies that are very niche, like data collecting to reporting, and you don't hear about this in the regular media. The oil and gas stuff is coming, it's being broadcasted all over, but how many people actually understand, and how do you see that we don't fall into the trap of, you know, that maybe something like is going on in Guyana and Trinidad.
Yeah,
Like,
it's hard. It's hard. It's, you have to understand that you have to be at a certain international level to compete, and that most likely U.S. based oil and gas companies will work with U.S. based contractors. It's like, unless you're really good, like really, 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 really good, and they have the guarantee that you deliver the same quality and in the same style that they prefer it. So it's going to be hard to get in. People have to understand that. And then um, when you talk about branding, local content from a creative perspective is even lesser known. So I don't even think that that is something that is of relevance to this industry at all. They don't really care. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's. I mean, you have to. One thing that I think people don't understand is um, this is an industry that, from a environmental perspective, it's really difficult to talk about because, like, you're making millions of dollars, like by extracting important minerals from Earth. In the sense of, if you don't know what the environmental consequences will be from taking oil and gas out of the bottom of the ocean, practically, and how that will impact the environment. Like, does the ocean go off balance? Can we consider getting floods? Can like, I don't know if you know the oil industry in the Netherlands, for instance, in the north of the Netherlands, and the impact that's there. So for I think for the
Actually, I'm not
last
familiar with that. So
okay, so for the last decade, for the last decade, the gas extractions from a certain area within the north of the Netherlands is having impact on the actual living environment of local inhabitants. So it's
right, 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 right.
impacting. And from a political perspective, it's constantly being said, yes, we have to research that. We have to research if it's really the gas industry that's causing these kind of problems. We have to research that. And basically, it keeps getting at research. There's never a
So
moment where they say, like, okay, we're going to stop doing this.
So on that point, if we're talking about we don't have the resources as suppliers, right? Not enough capacity, and also offshore companies preferring to work with these expats. They're getting their own contractors, bringing them in to work here. How much does the country itself, that's kind of has these blocks, has these regions, benefit from it? Because if you can provide your local people, your local content to get that economy circulating, to get that cash flow circulating back to the economy, what's left or what other options are there to get this? Because the risk is being taken by these offshore contractors. So what's being left?
Okay.
Should I
So let's
understand or see that?
so let's start with the silver lining. So the silver lining is that even though we as a country won't necessarily benefit directly from it, there is a still indirect um, benefit from it. First, if the oil and gas industry is productive in Suriname and it's efficient and it works and people pay, the government gets an increase in income as well, which makes it easier for the government to operate, which makes life in general better in Suriname. Let's be honest. So if there's a positive developments in the oil and gas industry, have a direct impact on lowering inflation, easing the need for uh, for dollars and euros in Suriname. So there's an indirect benefit. If our government profits from the oil and gas industry, the living situation in Suriname just gets better in general. Yes. So
So
from a very macro perspective.
yeah,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on before I
So
interrupt.
and then the second thing you have to understand is that even though there will only be a small amount of companies locally that will be able um, to join and be part of the industry, that company pays taxes. That company has employees that earn more. That company gets experts from abroad, and these people and these companies, they sort of indirectly invest in the Surinamese economy as well, because they have to buy or rent houses, they have to go out and eat somewhere, they have to spend their money during their free, their leisure time. And so indirectly, local businesses will profit from that as well.
Yeah,
So that's the
I
self-alignment.
understand. Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah.
understand that. But the the degree at which it impacts it, because coming back to our previous examples, as in Trinidad and Venezuela, Guyana is in that process now. Like, it's the same situation that played out, but how long does it last? And look at the inflation we have in Venezuela. So what's the the
So
the
you have to
rope?
have a smart, no, you have to have a smart government. You have to have a smart government that understands like you should reinvest and how to reinvest. And I think that will
So
be,
should we look at an example like Norway, for example, such as because they benefited a lot from their oil
okay.
reserves offshore,
So I'm going to be
and
very brief about, and this is a really unqualified take, but I do really feel that way about it. And we've had something in um, the Surinamese national culture is very different from the Norwegian Baltic, kind of like the Northern European culture.
yeah.
So I want to put emphasis on that. So you cannot replicate a structure of way of work for a European country and implement it in the Caribbean or in South America. It just won't work. There are too many factors that are different. So I think that's a very important lesson for us that we should learn. You can take positive impacts and positive studies and learnings from that situation, but you have to be very careful about it. So I think that's the first thing that we have to consider. The second thing that we have to consider is cultural differences within the region. So partnerships that Norway is able to close out with their neighboring countries and the EU, it doesn't work the same way in the Caribbean and in the CARICOM. So it would be nice to say like, hey, we could approach it like that. But there are different factors that you have to take in consideration that make it more difficult to replicate it, or even that it just doesn't work.
So for those unfamiliar with that aspect, because the reason I brought up Norway, aside from the cultural differences, is, and that was, I think, pre-EU, right? Or in the process of that, the European Union got that. So I think they were busy in the 80s and 90s already during that process. And they kind of pulled that income into a wealth fund. But that's also took like, yeah, I don't know how many generations, but decades to build over time. And then it comes to, it's funny that we were talking about the topic we talked about last week on time preference. It's the time preference thing. Because if the money flows immediately, looking at a country like Venezuela and Trinidad, you have a rapid rate of development, but then you can't keep up with it, and then it suddenly goes bust. So,
So you
do
do
you
understand
agree?
that previous governments in Suriname had to uh, almost wanted to give away rights and bidding
Yeah,
rights for loans to pay out salaries for the government, right? So, I
yeah,
mean, if you're talking time preference, you know what the current situation is. And that's why I'm saying, and to be
exactly.
fair,
On the
yeah,
cultural level, yeah, that's
yeah, and
understandable.
yeah. And that's something you have to take into consideration. I'm not saying something is right, I'm saying wrong. It's just you have to take that in consideration. And you also have to take in consideration that before oil and gas, Norway was already in a different position than we are currently in. So you can't compare apples with oranges in the sense
Yeah,
that
yeah.
we have to realize, and I think that's the hardest part. We have to understand that we're not Trinidad. We have to understand that we're not Venezuela. We have to understand that we're not Norway. We have to understand that we're not Dubai. So these are things that we have to understand that our system is structured differently. We have to understand that what changes we need to make that would benefit our country. And it's really hard to make changes to benefit your country if there are other influences available that are not geared towards our country first. And I think that's something that we have to address and keep on addressing that if we really want to do it properly, the income from the oil and gas industry should be there should be some level of responsibility or accountability from the government to provide insight and transparency in what it will be invested. And there will always be discussion about it, but at least provide the situation that it's clear how the incomes are going to be redistributed in our country.
Yeah, transparency and basically communication. And then I want to come back to a point, you mentioned we've kind of survived on very extractive industry, oil being one of them onshore, which is very small. If I look at the surface area, what I saw from the maps versus the potentiality that's offshore, right? And the other extractive industries are, mining, the mining industry. Those are more hard extractives. So looking at this extractive industry, I feel like countries like small countries like Suriname and basically dependent on these extractive industries are basically on life support because of the extractive industry. Like what parallel industry, not taking away from this industry or not the focus, can we take to be less dependent on it? Do you see? But
No,
before
well, there's several, but go ahead, go ahead.
no, before you go, because I think what was it, Stas Oli booth, there was a nice graphic with some 3D print, metallic print on it, and they Photoshop some skyscrapers within it between the capital city. And why did they paint that picture? And how did you interpret that picture? Because you had a Dubai comparison back in the day, but let's leave that behind
Okay, so I'm
for
going
a
to be
second.
completely honest. And this all ties back to, I think Rajiv asked the question once, how would I develop Suriname, right? So, and this is really me talking from a nationalistic perspective. We have so much land in Suriname, undeveloped land. And I'm going to tell you what would be the right approach, in my personal opinion. And I'm also going to tell you why that is not going to work. We have so much land. We can easily, with good urban planning and development, develop our districts in a way that we don't need skyscrapers for the next 50 or 100 years. We can easily focus on the different districts of Suriname, focus on the different needs of not only our country, but the region, South America, Latin America, the Caribbean, even the Americas, even Europe, and create different districts with different functionalities. And within each district, have all the infrastructure that it's a self-sustaining district, right? And with that, you would create a situation where you don't need high rises. You don't need to go as high as possible. The reason it doesn't work is there's a lot of ground in Suriname that has already been either bought by someone or given to someone. So there's a
Hmm.
lot of undeveloped land in Suriname which is no longer state owned and is owned by someone. And those people will not be willing to give up that piece of land for free and not even necessarily for the development of their own country.
Right, right, right.
Regardless how they got it, whether or not they paid hard cash for it or it was technically given to them.
Well, on the other side, the registry is so bad that it could be misplaced, but let's not speculate here.
No,
Um,
no, it's just that's the biggest issue. I mean, there's One of the things. Let me give you an
I
example.
actually
Like,
want to,
yeah,
aside from that
yeah.
reason that it might not work, I want to abstracate it more. Like if you look at, because you did urban planning and social studies, right? From a
No, I did urban planning and development from a cultural and social
okay,
science
from a
perspective.
cultural
Yes.
perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe
Yeah.
that might also shed insights, because as cities develop, as capitals, as major cities develop, because you're talking about each district becoming its own kind of superpower, right? Be basically decentralizing the nation in powerful districts or states. So
Get an
what you
oil
also,
and get an oil and gas district. Like, decentralize everything. Everybody is so extremely focused on centralizing everything in the capital. Like, make the capital like the main hub for everything to take place, but centralize your industries to different districts. Yes, that would make total sense.
and the reason I bring that up as, counter argument, just thinking out loud here, looking at how major cities developed, even in the developed countries, a lot of people from the less populated cities move away from those cities to, if we're looking the US, for example, to something like New York, to something like um, California, because they see opportunities. So even that region is getting thinned out. And I'm not sure how the situation is in the Netherlands. I'm not too familiar with the geography there, but major cities get that major because of that centralizing natural tendency to develop and go for opportunity. So, is this not a law of the evolution of societies and cities that eventually plays out over time?
Yes, because it's a financial decision, and that's the biggest problem. It gets so money focused, and I'm just going to be very very blunt about this. It gets so money focused that it's so much about the money and the profit that focusing on how society develops itself in a healthy, sustainable way, it's kind of like, and that's the thing, like, the sustainable development goals, everybody should know them, and not everybody should know them to say like, hey, I make a lot of profit, I have to do some corporate social responsibility. Let's use the sustainable development goals. No, you shouldn't have to announce it. You shouldn't have to broadcast it, say like, hey, look, I'm a good company because I'm doing this of sustainable development goals. No, it should be part of your culture. It should be part of your strategy. It's not like, oh yeah, I have to do it because it's one of the sustainable development goals. No, it's actually doing good for society, right? It's not because it's a sustainable development goal that you just put a plaque on the side of
Yeah, a
your
flag, and yeah,
a flag. No, you actually have to commit to it and actually do better. And that's the whole reason why there are these conspiracy theories on it being like it's a way to control us, because there are companies that say they do it, but they actually don't.
yeah,
And the
it's
conspirators look at those companies and see, like, see, you're just trying to control us. Actually, no, they're not trying to control you. They're actually the sustainable development goals are developed from a good place, from people that actually want to build a better society. But it's often people that kind of use it to wave around and say like, hey, I'm doing this, while not actually working towards making the world a better place. And that's where the disconnect is. And that's all the whole idea with oil and gas as well. It's like, um, I had to discuss with somebody who was actually an industry expert, and I was like, why don't they, like, the mining industry used to have a situation where they would invest in local community, right? So if you're in your business is somewhere, you invest in the local community, you build local schools, you build local roads, you have to help develop the community. And then um, there were actually studies done by these multinationals that those kind of systems, they don't work, so they decided we're just taking it out. And then the government is like, oh yeah, okay, we don't care about that either, so you can take it out as long as you give me a bigger cut. And then you get into a situation where society keeps on getting underdeveloped in the sense that the money that's being used in the industry,
Yeah, it's flowing to a narrower
it's
path.
it's it's flowing through a narrower path instead of flowing to an actually broader path.
And the other argument, because you're bringing up the conspiracy theorist idea, the other argument that often comes up is, the developed world kind of went through it this way, and that's how they got the position they are, right? And that now they're imposing these rules or these restrictions and all these things, and then the lesser developed countries can't walk the same path. And then you get this tension between, uh, ideas and how that's supposed to go further.
Okay, so let's go to the counter argument.
Yeah.
The reason why these Western countries use these methods is because they've learned from establishments in the past. Like they've learned from societies 300, 400 years ago. And we have to learn from societies 200, 300, 400 years ago as well. Like there have been some major empires, and we don't look at those teachings of those.
So
We
let's play
don't,
out that
yeah,
history. Let's play out
yeah.
that history.
Well, I'm not
So
familiar with most of them, to be honest. I know there were the Greeks and the Romans. Like I haven't studied. There are actually books on it, on why
yeah,
empires fail and the different stages that they go through.
yeah, I think that there's a short video as well, and a book of Ray Dalio and the rise and fall of the empires through
Exactly.
different stages, right? And it kind of goes to, you have the big development stage, they become a superpower, and they get to that superpower position because they've managed to either first control either military might or resources because they found certain resources, and then they could have produced that easier. And then as the military might increased, they managed to build better infrastructure. And as you get better infrastructure, you can facilitate trade. And because you have better trade routes, other countries will or other regions will start using those trades. So you can generate income from that. And then you get the talk about like what is money from the previous episode, that starts going into play. Who he who controls the money kind of controls the flow of power, and then they start going into the debt based system, and eventually those resources kind of dilute. You can't pay off the military anymore, and that kind of slowly crumbles as another empire kind of slowly rises and kind of facilitates that in the same way again. So I'm curious to know from you, where do you think the smaller countries basically satellite around these bigger countries, but because that's usually doesn't get described in history. And how can we think about that, like the smaller regions when they satellite
So,
around these
so
big
you have
empires?
to consider like, do you want to be the best kept secret or not?
Yeah.
Right? That's so from a center periphery theory, like if we're
uh,
really
uh,
talking
uh,
urban development, there's called
yeah.
the center periphery theory. Basically, you have the center where everything takes place, and then you have the periphery, which kind of, and the center decides for the whole world. So when you look at it from an economics perspective, you have New York, London, Tokyo, right? So if you look from an economics perspective, you have New York, London, Tokyo. Those are the cities in which the economic balance of the world gets decided. Of course, there are other entities and things as well, but we mainly look at those things. Like the New York Stock Exchange has kind of the biggest influence on everything. Like it's so
Yeah,
preposterously big
any
that
industry basically.
yeah.
It's not just the
So
oil and gas, it's any
so
industry.
it's any
The
industry. So if you understand that, you have to understand that if you really are interested in being part of the center, you have to start and go there and invest. Like whether it's investment in actual cash, it's investment in knowledge, investment in resources. That's if you want to be part of the biggest, and it's also the most competitive. So it's not like, "Ah, I'm going to go there and I'm going to get successful." No, it's the most competitive markets. It's like the most insane markets. Everything moves 10 times as quick as you're used to. So that's something people don't understand, is either is
And
it's how the movement is, but also the quality of the movement.
when you mentioned how to be like, I'm not sure if I'm using the right word, the best kept secret, right? Being
Yeah.
the best kept secret around the periphery. So how can a best kept secret thrive?
A best kept secret can thrive through making decisions that improve the way of life, the state of life, the quality of life, and at the same time, not go into much into um, over. What was the correct way of using word? Yeah, overselling itself. So let's take it from a VC perspective. You have some companies that go into a bidding round for venture capital, and they promote
So yeah,
themselves as the newest, most amazing company possible. And they get all the funding. They get millions of dollars of funding, but they can actually produce and develop what they've promised to all those funders. And then after a couple of years, something happens. They're not able to respond to it, and they kind of lose everything. I mean, these are real life cases that happen. Like, and I'm very wary of that. I'm fairly well aware that I could come with a product and get people to buy it heavily, and it could fail, and I would have tens of thousands of people looking at me and saying like, "Hey, you brought me into this. It's your fault, and you're responsible for this." That's one of the things you have to, if you want to make it big, want to get extremely large international fame. That's one of the main concerns, especially with a company that is in a new industry. People see it as a buzzword. Everyone wants to buy in, but you don't have the actual knowledge and experience to do it. Like it's the same kind of situation.
okay. And then as we go to the last quarter of this episode, I want to lighten it up a bit and go back to the roots. Oil and gas, or the oil industry, has been kind of crucial to the development of basically the economy, technology, society in general. Why is that? What's
So
the
let's
magic of
rephrase.
oil and gas?
No, again, like, can you rephrase it, or yeah, or give, yeah,
Yeah, so basically, society has developed at a rapid pace since we found a way, or mankind has found a way, to use gas as an energy source.
yeah.
And it's been the most easily produced type or extractive. And there's been a whole industry built around it, right? And alternatives are popping up versus, because it all comes down to energy. And you got the renewable movements now with water powered, but not every region has that power. You can't really transport that. Solar is another thing. It is the efficiency there is different. Wind is another thing. It's very region specific. But oil you can transport to anywhere, use it anywhere. So that's how I see why it came the preferred. Basically, you can store and package and transport that energy more easily.
So I'm
So
I'm
that
not, yeah, I'm not sure, and like I don't have the technical background to answer that question. That's why I don't. And I was trying to see if whether or not there's a way of explaining it, but I think you
yeah,
mentioned the value. I think there's
yeah,
also,
I'm
yeah,
trying to abstract it why
yeah,
society in general gravitated towards oil, because in essence it's energy, right? And newer forms of energy have been
yeah, but it
created, like
also has another function, right? Is there still a
Uh,
connection? Is there still a connection to oil and the U.S. state, USA state reserve?
I would guess so, yeah, because but before that, understanding that the oil and the reserve of the U.S. It's basically that oil was already being used as a way to fuel energy and the economy, and basically, and this is pure speculation, the U.S. has a lot of oil reserves, and they're basically extracting and controlling just as the U.S. dollar where that gets extracted, etc. But movements like alternative forms of energy, like nuclear, have been kind of also debunked while it is more efficient with newer research that has been done. But because of other risks, you know, people still gravitate to the tried and true methods of oil. Oil.
Yeah, there's also, and that's something that we should also take into consideration. It's also been duped that oil will be the main source for the next maybe 15 years, and after that, it will kind of slowly move
No,
away.
I personally don't see the reserves drying up soon.
No,
I
it's not about
personally,
the reserves drying up. It's about and okay. So I'm gonna give a hot take.
yeah. This is what we're here for.
Yeah, I'm gonna give a hot take. I'm not sure if you're noticing, but there is a new world order on many different economic levels.
Yes,
And the
I can.
first place I realized it is when it comes to the FIFA, because I'm a man
Yes,
of sports.
yeah.
So I'm noticing that
Am I thinking about the same thing you're going at? Middle East.
different. I'm
Oh.
thinking about the bids for the World Cup and how many bids have gone to countries outside of outside of Europe.
Hmm.
Right, the UEFA, the European countries had much bigger grip on FIFA in the past than they have now. So that's one thing that's worth noting. But I also see it in the ownership of teams, that you're seeing that more and more teams, sports teams, are being owned by non-European owners. You're also seeing it in the sponsorships of teams and the logos and the companies that actually sponsor certain teams. But if you really want to see it, you should only look at Formula One and how much money gets put into Formula One and how many races are um, outside of Europe. And then you can even go to the UFC and see how many events are being hosted outside of Europe. And so when it comes to the new economic powers, there are not a lot of new economic powers going around. And you can see that there are different uh, Middle Eastern countries that have a say in things now that they didn't have beforehand, and that buy into different kind of industries more. You're seeing the BRICS and the OPEC claiming certain amounts of power and making certain decisions. So it's really important to look at the OPEC countries. It's important to look at the BRICS countries and the role they play within the decisiveness of certain industries in the world. And that wasn't the case previously. So there's a kind of old money, new money situation going about. And that's an interesting development, especially in the oil field and oil and gas as well, on how much the price of oil, a barrel of crude oil, is being impacted in the world economy as well.
Yeah, because that is basically the reason the US maintained that power because they enforced it being priced in a certain amount of US dollars per gallon, right? Per barrel. And these other superpower are, from my understanding, trying to detach from that, and then you get the economic dynamic. So
So
I honestly,
geopolitically, the hot take is like there are different countries taking over different parts of the world, and that brings major change in how things were previously done.
okay, and expanding on that hot take, or my counter take is, I don't see it happening yet within the next decade or two, even though there's a lot of movement
So
yet.
in some sense, things go quicker than they used to go, and some
Yeah.
sense things move slower. And I mean, I can see it because I'm in a relatively new field with social media, and I can see the impact, the improved impact, because we haven't even talked about um, the next generation of wealth. Like right now, there's one Mr. Beast, but 20 years from now, there will be 2,000 Mr. Beasts. So that's something you have to take into consideration now.
True, true, true.
And
So,
the
and
philanthropy that Mr. Beast does is completely different from the philanthropy that Bill Gates does. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because Bill Gates is still relevant today and will be relevant in the next 20 years. Even when there are 2,000 Mr. Beasts, Bill Gates will still be relevant.
yeah,
And when it
it's a
comes to things
it's
not
a
moving as quick,
different type
it's
of
the same.
impact.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just like the rise to fame, it's a slow burn. It's nothing moves at all, and then suddenly everything moves at once. Once you have that catalyst moment. But yeah, on a personal side, I don't see that happening. Another to end on a fun note, if you're talking about opportunities and how much we're dependent on extractive industries here, like the smallest nation in the world, I think it's Tuvalu, 10% of their national income comes from royalties from Twitch because of the .tv domain. So take a second to let that sink in, how these different radical types of industries impact a small country like that. You're muted.
Are you saying that we should sell the .sr to the US for their seniors and take royalties from it?
Well, it's an option. It's an option because it just so happens that the abbreviation for Tuvalu was TV, and Twitch.tv became so big because it is one of the big entertainment domains. They get royalties from that because domains are assigned to countries now, right? Oh, because of the
You know that
assignment of the.
Eminem promoted one of his albums through shady.sr.
There we go. that that that's some crazy opportunities that on other fields that are creative ways to basically get the income flowing. But yeah, that
So
was just a fun tidbit I got this past week, and I was like, oh, that is interesting. But
so I'm
yeah,
really
interesting
wondering.
discussion.
So the reason I'm bringing this up, and this is worth to research. So a couple of albums ago, Eminem promoted his latest album through shady.sr, right? And it was probably done through somebody. And if you go to shady.sr now, you get to shadymusic.com. And it's uh, not affiliated with Eminem or Shady Records anymore. But it used to be.
Someone clearly banked on it.
Yeah, clearly banked on it.
Yeah. So I'll leave that to the domain authorities. All right, this was a very different but interesting topic to discuss about because from individuals, us mainly, who aren't as involved in the field, it's always good to have discussions in other fields, around other fields where you're not domain expertise. Also to understand like how you yourself, but also how other people might perceive it and what kind of impact it can have on the broader spectrum. Yeah. And yes, the money flows very narrow now, but curious to see how that will play out in the next 2 3 decades with Guyana especially. And are we going the same footsteps as our other Latin American neighbors or not? But only time will tell. We can't predict the future. We can only play the cards we're dealt with. But with that being said, keep up to date with the developments. That's the only way you'll survive. Keep learning and keep listening to Social Confoes. Follow us at Instagram at Confoes, CONFOES, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Diego Amirali, or just search Social Confoes and you'll just find the channel right there. With that being said, Chanduk, roll us out.
Thank you for an interesting episode, Diego. Thank you for listening in. If you've listened in through the recordings, remember that we always upload new recordings to streaming service at the end of the month. And if you want to catch us live, don't forget to subscribe to Diego Amarali's YouTube channel. This has been Social Confos. We'll see you back next week, same place, same time. Bye bye.